Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of James Garfield, and the focus is assassination. The year is 1881, and we begin this episode talking about Charles Guiteau, a 40-year-old man who was originally from Freeport, Illinois. At the age of 19, Guiteau had joined the utopian society, the Oneida community in upstate New York, where he spent about 5 years, but his behavior became increasingly erratic, and eventually they asked him to leave. That erratic behavior continued into his marriage, where his wife actually was fearful of Guiteau and eventually left him, and even his sister, who was one of the longest to stick with him, a few years before in 1875, it eventually concluded that I had no doubt then of his insanity. He was losing his mind. Well, Guiteau's had a habit that he would sort of stay one step in front of everyone else. He would go to a new town just before the rent was due. He would move on to the next town. Eventually, he decided to latch into the political arena in the 1880 presidential election. He wanted to support Ulysses Grant for that position, but since Grant didn't get the nomination, he turned to Garfield. And he actually wrote out a speech, a 3-page speech that he planned to give on Garfield's behalf. Now, he never gave that speech, but somewhere along the line, in his own mind, writing that speech had somehow helped catapult Garfield into the presidency, and that Guiteau was therefore deserving of some kind of reward. Well, sure enough, like hundreds of other office seekers, he showed up at the White House right after Garfield's inauguration looking for a job, and he stood in line and eventually got to see the president. He showed him his speech, he said how important he was to the election, and he asked for a position to go and be a minister either to Austria or to France. Garfield gave him a couple of minutes of his time, quickly shuffled him all along and moved on to the next person. But Guiteau was certainly not going to give up. He kept showing up every day at the White House before Garfield's secretaries eventually had to just continue to push him aside. So Guiteau went to the next step. He wanted a job in the Foreign Service, so he sought out the Secretary of State. He began badgering James Blaine, and Blaine initially was polite to him, but eventually he shut him down. On May the 14th, he said that Guiteau, in my opinion, no prospect whatever of receiving the appointment, and he told him flat out, never speak to me about the Paris consulship again. Well, at this point, Guiteau was getting upset. He blamed Blaine, he blamed Garfield, he was embittered, he wasn't getting his just due. Now, he saw himself also as a stalwart, which was a supporter of Roscoe Conkling. And last episode, we talked about the conflict between Garfield and Conkling had resigned from the Senate, and this was the final straw to turn Guiteau into a killer. Guiteau said at this moment, this is May the 18th, if the president was out of the way, everything would go better. In the president's madness, he has wrecked the once grand old Republican Party, and for this he dies. On June the 8th, Guiteau bought a .44 caliber revolver for $10. Now, he had never shot a gun before, so he went out to the middle of nowhere, he started practice shooting, and he began to stalk his prey. As for James Garfield, Abraham Lincoln had just been assassinated a couple of decades before. This was a dangerous position, but Garfield was dismissive of anything about having a bodyguard. He said that assassination can no more be guarded against than death by lightning, and it is best not to worry about either, so he essentially went through life unguarded. Well, Guiteau had his chances in the month of June to go for Garfield when he was around the White House, when he went to church, one night when he was outside of James Blaine's house, and Guiteau was stalking him at each of these places, but he had yet to pull the trigger. He set his sights on July the 2nd. What was this date? Garfield had announced that he was leaving for vacation. He would be at the train station to go see his wife on the Jersey Shore. Garfield woke up that morning of July 2nd in a joyous mood. He was ready to put work behind him. He wanted to see his wife and his daughter. He was all ready for this beautiful little trip. And he went along with James Blaine off in a carriage to the train station. Actually had a couple of his boys, Harry and Jim, following along in a carriage just behind. They arrived at the train station in downtown Washington, D.C. about 10 minutes before his train was going to leave. He entered through the ladies' waiting area, and waiting there was Charles Guiteau, literally laying in wait. As Garfield entered the room, Guiteau walked up behind him. He pulled his trigger of his .44 caliber revolver. Garfield is struck. He's struck in the arm. He's shocked. He says, "My God, what is this?" Well, again, the bullet had just struck Garfield's arm, so Guiteau knew that if he wanted to finish his mission, he needed to fire another shot, which he did, directly into the back of James Garfield. Well, Garfield now went down. There was chaos in the room. A ticket agent stepped forward by the name of Robert Parke, who grabbed Guiteau, handed him off to a policeman by the name of Patrick Kearney. Kearney then quickly hustled Guiteau out of there off to jail, at which point Guiteau claimed, "I am a stalwart. Arthur is now President of the United States," somehow fulfilling some destiny in his mind. He was off to jail, perfectly content that he had fulfilled his destiny. In the meantime, back in the train station, Garfield's situation is dire. His blood is oozing out of his back. He's spitting up blood. He's vomiting. Within 5 minutes, the first doctor arrives, Smith Townsend, who is the lead health official for Washington, D.C. Garfield was placed on a mattress to try to make him a little bit more comfortable, and the initial goal of his doctors was to try to find the bullet, and they start probing into his back with their fingers. And next up was Charles Purvis, who became the first black doctor to ever treat a president of the United States. He was a local surgeon. He came in to try to help out Smith Townsend and was trying to put a brave face on things for Garfield, but Garfield frankly wasn't having it. He looked at the doctor and said, "I thank you, doctor, but I am a dead man." Now, this was essentially true, but it wasn't the bullet that would kill James Garfield. It was actually his treatment. 16 years before this, the topic of antisepsis was actually invented by Dr. Joseph Lister over in England, where he used chemicals to sterilize his instruments, his hands, and by doing so, dramatic effects of preventing post-surgical infections. He wrote about this, spread the word around the world, but there were skeptics everywhere, including the biggest in the United States. Germs they couldn't see were causing infection. This was hocus pocus as far as the American medical community was concerned. One editor of the prestigious medical record actually wrote that, "Judging the future by the past, we are likely to be as much ridiculed in the next century for our blind belief in the power of unseen germs as our forefathers were for their faith in the influence of spirits, of certain planets and the like, inducing certain maladies." This was the belief in the United States, and for the doctors and the skeptics involved in Washington, D.C., one of them was Willard Bliss. Willard Bliss was called immediately by the Secretary of War, Robert Lincoln, to help out with Garfield. Now, Robert Lincoln had seen Bliss try to help save his father when he was assassinated a couple of decades before. Well, Bliss arrives and he is taking charge. He basically kicks everyone else aside. He gets out his own hands, and again, he's a disbeliever in antisepsis. He is probing. He brings a couple of probes, unwashed. He sticks those in Garfield's back, trying to find that bullet. They couldn't find the bullet. And things were not looking good for Garfield, so they took him on that mattress, they carried him outside, put him in a carriage, brought him to the White House, brought him to an upstairs bedroom. In the meantime, Lucretia, his wife, and Mollie, his daughter, were informed of this in New Jersey. They got on a train, they arrived that night. Now, Lucretia Garfield was shaken at this moment, but she was going to remain calm for her husband's purpose. She went in and said, "Well, my dear, you are not going to die, as I am here to nurse you back to life. So please, do not speak again of death." Now, the family got a little bit concerned about Dr. Bliss because he was just taking total control and he wasn't listening to any other medical opinion. So some family members actually called in some of their doctors and some of their friends and some of their relatives, but Bliss frankly shut him out. This was his show, and Garfield didn't change things, so Bliss was going to be in charge of this thing from beginning to end. Vice President Chester Arthur also showed up. Arthur was frankly more terrified about this than probably Garfield was of dying. Arthur was terrified of becoming president. Arthur was very happy to be vice president, or a job where he had virtually no responsibilities and lots of prestige. The idea of being president absolutely terrified him. He stayed to visit with Mrs. Garfield for a couple of hours. Dr. Bliss wouldn't even let him go in to see his patient. And after that, Arthur left. He went back to New York basically to hide out and hope that Garfield would survive. Well, Garfield actually continued to improve, and the most upbeat notice that came from Dr. Bliss was on July the 13th of 1881, 11 days after the shooting. He actually was in pretty good shape. But this rally was short-lived. The infection that was beginning to grow from all those probings of the unwashed fingers, that was starting to grow inside of James Garfield, and it was starting to have a big effect. By July the 23rd, his fever had shot up to 104 degrees. Surgeons came in and they drained out massive amounts of pus. All of a sudden, the diagnosis was pretty dire in terms of what was going to happen for James Garfield. In the meantime, some innovations were taking place. Now remember, this is in the summer, hot and humid, very uncomfortable time of year to be in Washington, D.C., let alone be in this bed, having been shot, not doing well. And so the engineers came together and created essentially the first air conditioner. This was a crude electrical device, a contraption that they rigged together where air would be blown from cool air from another room into the president's bedroom. They used 6 tons of ice to actually fuel this contraption, and it worked. It did make him a little bit more comfortable. The other innovation was to try to find the bullet, and for this they turned to the inventor, Alexander Graham Bell, who had actually recently taken a leave from his telephone company to get back into the lab, try to invent some more things, and he was on the mission to create something that he eventually called his induction balance. He worked day and night. He totally exhausted himself in his lab throughout the month of July to create something that could use electronics to try to detect the lead in that shot that was in Garfield's body. Well, things weren't looking very good on July the 20th, and so Dr. Bliss agreed to let Alexander Graham Bell come in and try his contraption out. Except Bliss said, "I'm going to run the test." So Bell said okay, and Bliss took the equipment and ran it over Garfield's right side of his body, up and down the right side of the body, and it found nothing. Well, Bell was very disappointed in this. He was convinced his machine would actually work. He went back to the lab and he continued to work at it day and night. And he was testing it on Civil War soldiers who knew that they had bullets still in their body, and he was detecting them. He was convinced this was going to work. Well, as Garfield was not rallying, Dr. Bliss agreed, let's give Bell one more chance. July 31st, he came back to the White House, and this time Bell actually administered the test. But once again, Bliss said you can only focus on the right side of the body. He waved his contraption up and down, and he actually started to detect something, and Bliss thought that was it. That must be the bullet on the right side of the body, but Bell wasn't convinced. And sure enough, it was found out later, it was not the bullet that he found. It was actually some of the metal in a mattress a couple of layers below Garfield on the right side that was actually sending him the signal. We know it wasn't the bullet because the bullet wasn't on the right side. It was on the left side, and we'll find out about that in the autopsy. But needless to say, they didn't find the bullet despite all of these efforts, including a lot of probing by hand. By August, the optimism had basically faded away. The infection had spread. It was ravaging Garfield's body. They drained him again. Another large amount of pus came out, and Garfield tried to put a brave face on things when he wrote a letter. The only letter he wrote through this entire period was to his mother on August the 11th, in which he said, "It is true I am still weak and on my back, but I am gaining every day and need only time and patience to bring me through." Well, there was no evidence to actually suggest that this was going to happen. Well, it was also could no longer hold down food, and this was the next emergency for Garfield. He had lost 40% of his body weight, down to 130 pounds. Dr. Bliss started feeding him via enemas. Didn't do much good. Eventually, Garfield, frankly, was resigned to his fate, and all he wanted to do was die peacefully. They all agreed they would take him to the Jersey Shore, where he sort of longed to go if he was going to go quietly and peacefully to a beach house in Elberon, New Jersey. Hundreds of volunteers actually worked through the night to extend some train tracks from the main line an extra 3,200 feet to Franklin College, where Garfield was going to be brought. And on September the 6th, he went that 7-hour journey. They carried him upstairs at Franklin College, elevated the head of the bed so he could gaze upon the ocean, and Garfield said, "This is delightful. The fishermen at sea, the vessels on the ocean, and the bathers on the surf, I am myself again." Garfield lasted 2 weeks. September 19th, in the evening, his fever spiked to 108 degrees. It's 10 o'clock. He yells out, "Oh, Swaim, Swaim," to his buddy David Swaim. "I am in terrible agony. Can't you do something to relieve me? Oh, my heart, the terrible pain." He then became unconscious. At 10:35, Dr. Bliss said it was over. He had pronounced James Garfield dead. Final moments, he was being able to stay with Lucretia, his wife of 23 years, spent some quiet time with him. Eventually, she left the room. The 20th president was no more. James Garfield was dead 2 months shy of his 50th birthday. Dr. D.S. Lamb performed the autopsy, and he found two things. Number one, it was the infection that had consumed Garfield's body that was clearly the cause of death, not the bullet. And that's the number two finding. That bullet, which again was not on the right side of his body, it was on the left side of his body. It was actually safely secured in the fatty tissue below the pancreas. It wasn't going to harm anyone. The body had done its job to protect Garfield from that bullet. Basic antisepsis, if that had been used, there's no question that Garfield would have had a full recovery. He just would have carried that bullet inside him like Andrew Jackson had done for a couple of bullets from his days as a duelist. He should have been fine, but that was not the science of the day, at least not in the United States. As for Dr. Bliss, his doctor, he was proud of his work. He submitted a bill to Congress for $25,000 for his service. Congress thought that was way too much. They authorized $6,500, and Bliss was insulted by this. He refused to accept it, but his reputation was badly damaged over this entire affair. He struggled both personally and professionally for the last 7 years of his life. As for Charles Guiteau, 3 weeks after Garfield died, he was in court and he pled not guilty to the crime of murdering the president. According to Guiteau, insanity was the reason for his defense and that it was God's act and not mine. The divine pressure on me to remove the president was so enormous that it destroyed my free agency, and therefore I am not legally responsible for my act. Well, in terms of a backup strategy, Guiteau went one step further. He blamed the doctors. According to Guiteau, General Garfield died from malpractice. The doctors who mistreated him ought to bear the odium of his death and not his assailant. He later added that I deny the killing, if your honor please. We admit the shooting. And there was some semblance of truth to this, as we've talked about, but it was no matter to the jury. He had fired the bullet that led to Garfield's death in less than 1 hour. That jury came back with a guilty verdict, and Charles Guiteau was hanged on June 30th, 1882, just a couple of days shy of the 1-year anniversary of the day that he shot James Garfield. James Garfield, as we talked about in the previous episode, was indeed the Horatio Alger myth come true. The only, in America, rags to riches story from that one-room log cabin in Ohio all the way to the presidency of the United States. In no other country on earth could something like this have occurred. Of course, the presidency for Garfield was miserable from day one. All those office seekers, one of whom was deranged. And on the 120th day of his presidency, he gunned down James Garfield before his presidency could get started. 80 days later, he was dead. The tragic ending for a man who had seemingly fulfilled the American dream. That's James Garfield, an assassination, from the life of James Garfield. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.